The fluorescent lights in the compound hummed faintly, a steady rhythm that echoed through the reinforced corridors. It was supposed to be another uneventful night shift, the kind that made soldiers restless because nothing ever happened. She had been assigned to internal security, a support position, monitoring, reporting, following orders. But there was something different about this night, an unease she couldn't quite name. She noticed it in the way the air felt thicker, in how the technicians avoided eye contact, and in the sudden arrival of new orders that didn't make sense. Her commanding officer called her into the gear room just before the next patrol cycle. The tone in his voice carried an edge of irritation rather than authority. "You won't be needing your kit tonight," he said, his words clipped, final. She froze for a second, trying to understand. Her kit, her armor, her sidearm, her comms unit, all of it was standard, essential. "Sir, I'm on active watch," she reminded him, her voice even but sharp. He didn't meet her eyes as he replied, "Orders from above. You're to stay unarmed and report only." It wasn't the first time she'd faced discrimination in the field. To some, her presence still didn't fit their definition of a soldier. They called her tech support or eyes in the chair, as if she hadn't endured the same training, the same pain, the same nights crawling through mud and live fire. But this was different. This wasn't casual disrespect. This was deliberate. They were stripping her of the tools she needed to do her job. She unclipped her holster slowly, the metal buckle clicking open like a quiet insult. One by one, she laid her weapons on the bench, the sidearm, the combat knife, the small comm tablet. The room felt colder with each piece she surrendered. When she placed her armor vest down last, it landed with a dull thud, a sound that felt heavier than it should. The officer gave a curt nod and walked out without another word. For a few seconds, she stood alone, staring at the empty rack where her gear used to hang. The dim light caught the sheen of the metal, the fingerprints she had left on her sidearm, the faint scratches on her helmet from old missions. Every mark told a story, every dent a memory of survival. And now, stripped of it all, she felt the weight of vulnerability pressing against her ribs. But beneath it, something else stirred, something colder, sharper. Anger. She walked down the hall to her station, her boots echoing against the concrete. The other soldiers barely glanced her way. Some smirked quietly, the kind of smirk that said they agreed with the decision. She ignored them. She had learned long ago that ego was the loudest form of weakness. Her hands moved automatically, checking the perimeter feed, scanning thermal readings, reviewing the motion detectors. Her body was calm, but her mind was coiled tight, alert for anything that didn't fit. Outside, the wind howled faintly across the desert terrain. Visibility was low. The compound was surrounded by electronic fencing and motion-triggered lights, supposedly impenetrable. But she had studied enough breaches to know that no system was perfect. The feeds flickered for a fraction of a second, so small a glitch that most would have ignored it. But she didn't. Her eyes locked onto the screen, muscles tensing as she rewound the footage. There it was, a shadow moving just beyond the camera's edge, a ripple in the darkness that didn't match the wind's rhythm. Someone was out there. She leaned closer, adjusting the filter, trying to get a clearer image. The feed cut again, longer this time. She checked the backup channel. Static. The backup power unit hummed irregularly, the low throb of interference pulsing through the wall. Something was jamming their system. Her first instinct was to call it in, but then she remembered. She didn't have comms anymore. They'd taken that too. She stood up, pushing the chair back so hard it slammed into the console. The sound echoed through the room, drawing a quick glance from one of the nearby guards. "You good?" he asked lazily. She nodded, forcing a calm expression, but her pulse was racing. In her mind, she mapped the layout of the compound, recalling every blind spot, every maintenance duct, every escape route. She had helped design some of the internal security protocols herself. If someone was coming in, she knew exactly where they'd try to breach. Her gaze drifted to the maintenance corridor, unwatched, quiet, and only 20 meters away from the main control hub. She didn't need her gear to know what was happening. The pattern was too precise, the interference too intentional. Whoever was out there wasn't testing defenses, they were already inside. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadying as her instincts took over. The training that everyone thought she'd forgotten, the part they said she didn't need, began to surface again. The compound's speakers buzzed faintly with a distant, alert tone, low, distorted, then abruptly cut off. She turned toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the base. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied again. Somewhere in that silence, beyond the walls, she knew they were moving closer. And she, stripped of everything they thought made her a soldier, was the only one who could see what was coming. The compound's outer perimeter stretched across the barren desert like a line drawn between safety and chaos. Beyond it, nothing but wind, dust, and shadows that came alive when the sun fell. It was the kind of place where silence had weight, where every footstep echoed longer than it should, and every flicker of movement made hearts jump. For weeks, there had been whispers about enemy infiltrators in the region, specialists trained to move through the dark without leaving a trace. No one took it seriously anymore. The soldiers inside had grown comfortable, convinced that the fences, sensors, and drones would protect them from anything human. But safety has a way of making people blind. The night began with a sandstorm, fierce and unrelenting. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the guards rotated shifts early to avoid exposure. In the command room, the security monitors glowed faintly, feeding endless lines of data about perimeter integrity. Everything appeared normal. Motion sensors read clean, cameras showed only the swirling sand, and the external alarms remained quiet. On the surface, it was just another storm. But buried beneath that calm, a silent intrusion was unfolding. They came in low, 6 of them, faces covered in sand-colored masks, moving with machine-like precision. Their boots barely broke the surface of the dunes, each step measured to avoid pressure-sensitive mines. They carried no lights, no radios. Each one had memorized the timing of the perimeter drones, the gaps in the sensor field, and the exact locations of the power relays. This wasn't a random raid. It was calculated, rehearsed, and perfect. The first breach came when they reached the northern fence line. One infiltrator pulled a thin metallic device from his pack, a signal disruptor no larger than a phone. He placed it against the power conduit, its silent pulse spreading outward, blinding the cameras for exactly 8 seconds. In that brief window, 2 of them slipped through, cutting a hole just wide enough to crawl under. Once inside, they patched the fence back together to erase the evidence. The lights never even flickered. The others followed, synchronized like gears in motion. They moved through the maintenance trench, avoiding the patrol routes by seconds. The sandstorm masked their presence, the static from the wind cloaking their interference. They reached the second barrier, a steel gate leading into the auxiliary generator yard. One of them crouched beside the lock, inserting a small probe. Sparks flared for an instant, then vanished. The lock clicked open. Inside the compound, the operators still stared at their screens, unaware that the data they were seeing had already been looped. The infiltrators had fed the system a false stream. A clean perimeter, normal readings, no motion detected. The woman at the secondary console noticed a slight delay in the feed, half a second off from the live clock. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, her instinct whispering that something was wrong. But before she could confirm it, the storm outside roared louder, the interference growing thicker, and the small anomaly vanished from her display. The infiltrators split into 2 groups once inside. 3 moved toward the control hub, their target clear, disable communications, and isolate the command staff. The other 3 headed for the barracks, where the night watch teams were resting between shifts. Every step was planned, every breath timed to the rhythm of the storm. They were ghosts, unseen and unheard. In the shadows of the main corridor, one of them paused, listening. He heard faint voices, a guard chatting idly with another, their laughter careless and slow. The infiltrator raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. A soft mechanical click followed, and the guard's voice cut off mid-sentence. The silence returned, deeper now. They dragged the bodies into an alcove, covered them with a tarp, and continued. The cameras above them remained frozen on an empty hallway, their lenses fooled by the feed disruption. At the same time, the backup generator lights flickered inside the main command post. A technician frowned at the console, tapping the screen. "Power surge," he muttered, but the reading stabilized a second later. He didn't know that the infiltrators had just cut into the underground cable running beneath his feet, rerouting it to mask their approach. By the time they reached the central control room, the storm had begun to die down. The air grew still, heavy with the kind of quiet that signals something is about to break. One of the infiltrators placed a palm-sized explosive against the sealed entry door, timed for minimum sound output. The blast was muffled, barely audible beyond the hallway. The door swung open with a soft hiss. Inside, a soldier looked up from his screen just in time to see a shadow move. He opened his mouth to call for help, but the sound never came. A gloved hand covered it before the word could form. 6 infiltrators. 6 seconds. No alarms. In another part of the compound, the woman without her gear stood at her post, unaware that danger was already inside. But something tugged at her attention again, the same flicker on the monitor she had noticed earlier. Her gut twisted as she zoomed in on the feed, the pixels shifting in ways they shouldn't. She didn't have her weapon, her comms, or her armor, but she could feel it. The air had changed. Somewhere beyond the cameras, inside the storm of sand and darkness, 6 intruders were already moving through the corridors, closing in on their targets, and not a single alarm had gone off to warn them. The first gunshot didn't sound like a gunshot at all. It was muted, distant, carried away by the last whisper of the sandstorm outside. But for those inside the compound, it was enough to freeze every muscle. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the hum of the generators faltered. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed shut, followed by the faint metallic scrape of boots on concrete. In that moment, the illusion of safety shattered. The infiltrators were no longer ghosts outside the fence. They were inside the veins of the base, moving fast, precise, unstoppable. In the chaos that followed, confusion became the enemy. Soldiers scrambled for weapons, half-dressed and disoriented, unsure where the threat was coming from. The internal comms were dead, their screens flashing static. The radios hissed with nothing but distortion. Panic spread quietly at first, then in a wave. Someone shouted orders that no one could hear. The base had been trained for this scenario, but training didn't prepare them for darkness that moved like it was alive. The infiltrators worked methodically, cutting through each section with mechanical precision. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. Their formation moved like a tide. 2 clearing rooms, 2 covering the exits, and 2 advancing toward the central command core. It was over in minutes, but it felt endless. Every hallway echoed with silence. Every corner turned into a question of survival. Meanwhile, deep in the operations wing, she was still unarmed. Her rifle, her comms, even her tactical vest had been taken earlier that day after a security mix-up. She wasn't supposed to be on duty, but she'd stayed behind to finish a systems diagnostic. The irony hit her now. Of all the nights to be stripped of gear, it had to be tonight. She crouched beside the console, listening to the faint rumble of boots approaching through the ventilation shafts. The realization hit hard. They weren't here for supplies. They were here to cripple the base, to silence the command chain, to erase everything before reinforcements could respond. She glanced at the screens again, half of them dead, the other half looping fake footage. But one feed, deep in the maintenance corridor, glitched differently. For a split second, a shadow appeared that didn't belong. Her pulse quickened. She traced the movement, 6 figures moving toward the command hub, fast and low. Her instincts took over. She had no rifle, but she still had the map of the compound memorized. Every blind corner, every choke point, every supply crate that could become cover. Outside the command hub, the infiltrators reached the first junction. One of them knelt, placing a small device on the floor, an electromagnetic charge that would disable any nearby electronics. The red light on the device blinked once. They didn't notice the faint reflection from the polished floor tiles, the light of a console still active deeper inside the wing. She was watching them, tracking their every move. The corridors were narrow, built for defense, but now turned against their defenders. She moved quickly, barefoot to silence her steps, her breathing steady. She stopped by a maintenance locker, pulled it open, and grabbed the first thing her hands found. A carbon wrench, heavy and balanced. Not a weapon, but it would do. She slipped into the ventilation crawl space that paralleled the main hall, moving in near darkness. Every few meters, she paused to listen. The infiltrators' boots echoed below her, synchronized, deliberate. When they reached the next intersection, she saw them clearly through the grate. They were armed with suppressed rifles, their eyes hidden behind thermal goggles. One of them raised a hand, signaling for the others to stop. He tilted his head, scanning the shadows. For a second, she thought he had heard her. Her grip tightened around the wrench. The sound of her heartbeat filled her ears. The infiltrator lowered his hand, and they moved again. She exhaled quietly. She followed them until they reached the door to the command hub. The reinforced door was sealed, but they didn't intend to break it loudly. One of them pulled out a charge, magnetic and silent. They attached it to the lock, waiting for the signal. The leader raised 3 fingers, countdown. 3, 2, 1. But before the charge could detonate, a metallic crash echoed from the opposite end of the corridor. A maintenance shelf had fallen over. The infiltrators turned, weapons raised. Their formation shifted instantly, one covering the rear, the others fanning out. It was a distraction, one she had caused. She'd tossed a metal pipe through a vent opening, letting it hit the floor near the storage area. They moved toward it, just as she dropped silently from the ceiling into the shadows behind them. Her foot hit the ground softly, almost noiselessly, her wrench glinting faintly in the emergency light. She knew she couldn't take them head-on, but she could divide them, delay them, force them into the wrong corridor, the one leading to the generator room, where the voltage regulators could be overridden manually. She darted forward and triggered the auxiliary door controls from a side panel. The heavy bulkhead door slid down between her and the infiltrators, sealing them off from the command hub for the moment. Their muffled shouts echoed on the other side, followed by the sharp hiss of cutting tools. She sprinted toward the generator room, adrenaline flooding every nerve. The emergency lights flashed red. The alarms finally started to catch up. Somewhere, distant gunfire erupted near the east wing. The infiltrators were realizing that their perfect entry had turned messy. She reached the generator room, slammed the manual lock, and turned toward the control panel. Her hands flew across the keys, rerouting circuits, cutting power to non-essential systems. She needed darkness again, not for them this time, but for her. The base plunged into near-total blackout. Only the red emergency strips along the floor remained, glowing faintly like veins under the surface. She could hear them now, pounding against the door, their muffled movements sharp and impatient. She grabbed a fuse rod, twisted it loose, and clutched it like a spear. She didn't have armor, or backup, or time. But she had the element of surprise again. The storm outside had passed, but inside, something far more dangerous was just beginning. She moved like a shadow through the compound, every step measured, every breath soft against the hum of failing systems, turning the place that had stripped her of gear into a map of possibilities. Without armor or a radio, she depended on the only things that hadn't been taken from her: training, memory, and the way the building itself breathed. Vents that sighed, maintenance shafts that whispered, service doors that stuck if you pushed them just right. The first infiltrator met her not as a bullet, but as an obstacle. A metal ladder knocked loose with a calculated clang that drew him away from the corridor and into a choke point she had prepared by dragging a crate across the tile. He moved to investigate like a hunter following scent, and she waited behind a rack of spare cables until he was within arm's reach, then struck with the flat of her wrench across the back of his knees. He folded, a quiet collapse, and she used his own suppressed weapon, silenced but still heavy, to pin him in place until she could drag him into the shadow of an equipment alcove. She didn't have the luxury of one-on-one duels. The intruders were coordinated, practiced at moving in packs and cutting communications, and they flowed through the corridors like water through a ruin, finding seams and exploiting them. Her advantage lay in knowledge. A maintenance panel that hit a short, a stretch of hallway where the acoustic echo made footsteps seem farther away, a set of fire doors whose manual latch still worked if you knew where to push. She timed every diversion with the precision of a metronome. Swing open a cabinet to let the lights flash and draw attention, toss a bolt into an intake fan to create an odd vibration the enemy would check, slam a locker door to trigger a trained response. Each small deception pulled them out of formation, dissolved their confidence, and turned their speed into confusion. When 2 of them swept past a stairwell, she was already there, breathing shallow, palms pressed to the cool concrete, waiting for the exact moment their shadows passed the landing. She dropped down, using the momentum of a broken chair to slam into the first man's shoulder, twisting so his rifle banged uselessly against the wall. The second turned, surprised, and she met him with a blunt, practiced elbow to the jaw that knocked the breath from him. They fell like sacks of sand. There was no triumph in the way she bound their hands with strips of webbing from a discarded stretcher, only the grim efficiency of someone who had been taught to solve problems with her hands. Sound was her ally as much as her enemy. She understood how a corridor amplified panic and how absolute silence could deaden a hunter's confidence. She manipulated both. At one point, she set off a coupler in an adjacent service room, causing a slow leak of steam that hissed like static and encouraged two intruders to investigate with caution. While they fanned out, she slipped along the shadow line and used the narrow maintenance ladder to descend behind them, reaching a thigh and jerking a knee so hard the man overbalanced into the steam and coughed until his eyes watered. By the time he recovered, she had him in an arm lock behind a furnace, breath fogging in the heat, the wrench pressed to the base of his skull, a promise, not an execution. Improvisation became choreography. She threaded a length of paracord from a janitor's closet across a doorway at ankle height to snag the foot of a runner. She loosened the hinge on an overhead panel so that the third infiltrator to pass beneath it would be showered with a cascade of non-lethal wiring and insulation, immobilized by the surprise. When one of them tried to radio back to his team, she had already cut the feed by flipping the power strip in the exact pattern that would reset only the non-essential loops, something she'd learned months ago when repairing a miswired relay. The intruder's muttered curses were lost under the hum of generators and the distant wail of the emergency siren she'd triggered with a pressure plate she'd baited with an overturned cart. She didn't look to fight with weapons. She fought with space and physics. She pushed a heavy locker down a narrow corridor to create a bottleneck, forcing two men to funnel into a measured area where she could control the angles. She kicked a maintenance bicycle down a stairwell to create a sliding, clattering distraction that sent a prowler sprawling into her waiting hands. When the final infiltrator tried to sprint across the main atrium, blinded by the red emergency strobes, she cut the lights and used the dark like a cloak, appearing at his elbow with a violence that was precise and necessary, wrapping his wrists and dragging him down until he lay panting and defeated beneath a stack of plywood. There was no time for sentiment. 90 seconds was not an eternity. It was a crucible. She moved from contact to contact with a surgeon's speed, binding and blinding, using every surface, metal, concrete, glass, to amplify or muffle sound, to mislead line of sight, to control momentum. Her fingers were raw from contact with rough edges, her breaths ragged, but each captive she left was rendered incapable of further harm by the same quick knots medics taught for tourniquets and the same duct tape used for field repairs. By the time reinforcements punched through the outer gate, they found 6 men slumped in the gloom, breathing hard, wrists bound, mouths gagged, and a woman at the center, dirty, calm, hands still clenched around a wrench, whose only admission was a look that said they had misjudged what made her dangerous. Not the kit she carried, but the mind and the instincts that never had been taken away from her. The corridor was littered with echoes, the kind that made it impossible to tell where danger was coming from. She could hear them moving. 6 infiltrators sweeping the compound, their footfalls perfectly timed, their radios crackling in short-coded bursts. They believed they were hunting one unarmed woman. They had no idea she had already mapped their rhythm, counted their pauses, and learned their breathing. Her heart matched the tempo of their movement. Every step they took was a piece of a pattern she could break. 90 seconds. That was all it took for her to shift from hunted to hunter. She waited behind the medical bay door, crouched low enough that the flicker of red emergency lights didn't catch her eyes. The first intruder came fast, rifle raised, scanning for signs of life. She'd left a stretcher overturned, a blood bag torn open to drip steadily onto the floor. The sound drew him in, the kind of sound that messes with a soldier's instincts. Life, but not movement. The second he bent to inspect it, she was on him. One sharp blow with a metal tray to his neck, a twist of his shoulder that sent his weapon skittering. He dropped before he could shout, stunned by a hit placed not for pain but precision. She dragged him under the table and moved again before his body finished settling. 2 more followed down the hall, alerted by the faint thud. She ducked behind an open door, pressed flat, holding her breath as they passed. Timing was everything. When the first looked right, she kicked the edge of the door so it slammed into his partner, sending the second reeling. In that heartbeat of confusion, she used the motion of the rebound to pivot out, elbow meeting jaw, knee driving into the ribs. The man folded, his rifle clattering uselessly. The other barely had time to shout before she pulled the fallen man's suppressed weapon and fired once. Not to kill, but to shatter the ceiling light above them. Sparks rained down, masking her movement as she disappeared behind the curtain of flickering shadows. Now 3 down, the clock in her head ticking like a metronome. Every second stretched thin. She could feel her pulse syncing with the hum of the ventilation system, the faint vibration in the walls. She used it as a guide, tracing her way through maintenance corridors, calculating their search pattern. One was climbing the stairwell, another patrolled the eastern wing. The last 2 held the control room, confident they'd cornered her. She took the route no one sane would, through the service crawl space barely wide enough to crawl. Dust and old wiring brushed her shoulders. Each movement had to be silent, controlled, deliberate. She emerged behind the stairwell, just as the 4th infiltrator reached the landing. He didn't see her. She caught him mid-step, pulling his leg out from under him, driving his helmet into the railing. The impact echoed, sharp and final. His radio buzzed with static as the others called his name. She grabbed it, pressed the transmit button, and whispered 2 words in their own language, "Area clear." The silence that followed was perfect. It bought her just enough time to reach the control room door. Inside, the last 2 infiltrators were setting charges along the data wall, their attention fixed on their mission. She scanned the reflection in the glass pane beside the door. Their positioning, their stance. She needed exactly 2 movements, nothing more. She pushed the door open just enough to slide in low, using the handle to stay balanced as she kicked the base of the first man's leg. His weight collapsed forward, and his partner turned with instinct, but not speed. The wrench she'd taken earlier swung once, striking the rifle out of his hands, the recoil sending the barrel spinning across the floor. The noise was deafening in the confined room. They lunged at her together, 2 bodies of trained aggression, but she used their force against them. She ducked, pulled the strap of a fallen backpack through one's legs, and yanked. The fall tangled both men. She pressed her boot down on the detonator one of them had armed, pinning it harmlessly against the floor while she used her other hand to grab the nearest cable. In one swift motion, she wrapped it across their necks and arms, immobilizing them just as the alarms triggered again from the hallway. 90 seconds had passed, maybe a few more. The compound, once chaos, was silent again except for her breathing. Around her lay the proof of what instinct, timing, and training could do without a single weapon in hand. 6 infiltrators, each one neutralized with the kind of precision that doesn't come from rage, but from clarity. She checked their pulses, alive, disarmed, contained. She stood amid the wreckage of overturned equipment, her hair damp with sweat, the faint tremor of adrenaline still in her fingers. In the flickering emergency lights, she looked less like a soldier and more like a storm that had just passed through. Quiet now, but powerful enough to change the outcome of the night entirely. The command center was chaos when they broke through the door. Screens flickered, alarms screamed, and the security feed cycled through static and silence. 6 infiltrators had been detected entering the compound, but no gunfire, no radio chatter, no confirmation of resistance. Then one of the operators froze, eyes wide on the thermal camera. 6 bodies down, unmoving. And there, in the middle of the corridor, stood one woman, breathing hard, holding nothing but a wrench. For a long moment, no one said anything. The disbelief was almost louder than the alarms. They had stripped her of her weapons, her comms, her clearance. They had told her to stand down. Yet somehow, she had done what an armed team couldn't. She didn't look like a hero in that moment. Her uniform torn, her face streaked with dirt, hands trembling from the surge of adrenaline that still hadn't left her system. The corridor around her looked like a war zone. Equipment scattered, smoke drifting from burst wires, footprints smeared through dust and oil. Each fallen infiltrator lay where she had dropped them, breathing but beaten, their weapons kicked safely aside. When the tactical team reached her, weapons raised, she didn't move. She just looked at them, eyes calm but unreadable, like someone who had already fought her battle and had no energy left to explain it. The first words out of the commander's mouth weren't praise, but confusion. "How?" he demanded, staring at the motionless intruders. She didn't answer right away. The explanation wouldn't have made sense to him anyway. You can't quantify instinct. You can't brief someone on what it means to move when logic says don't, or how to find strength when every tool is taken from you. What she had done wasn't in any manual. It was the kind of thing that only happens when survival turns into certainty, when something deeper than training takes over. The men around her began securing the scene, zip-tying the infiltrators, checking for explosives, calling in medics. But every glance they cast her way carried a quiet shift. The same soldier they dismissed as non-essential personnel now stood among them, having done more unarmed than they'd managed fully equipped. They whispered about the 90 seconds, how she had somehow timed her attacks to the rhythm of their movement, how she'd taken control of a compound under siege without a single round fired. It wasn't just skill, it was defiance. When the report was written, it would list her actions clinically: neutralized 6 infiltrators, prevented detonation of charges, secured the East Corridor. But the real story wouldn't fit into words on a page. It was the silence between those words that told the truth, the disbelief, the respect, the slow dawning realization that they had underestimated her not because she lacked ability, but because she didn't fit their definition of a soldier. She had spent months in the shadows of the team, the one asked to observe, to assist, to stand aside. But when the lights went out and the compound fell into chaos, she didn't hesitate. She became the line no one else could hold. The commander tried to speak to her again, but she was already moving. She picked up her ID badge from the floor where it had fallen and clipped it back to her uniform with hands that still trembled. Around her, the tactical team cleared the last corners of the hall, calling out, "All clear." She didn't need the confirmation. She knew. She had felt the moment the compound shifted from fear to safety. It wasn't about victory. It was about restoration, the quiet after the storm. In the hours that followed, as dawn broke over the compound and investigators documented every inch of the scene, she sat on the edge of the steps outside, the cold air brushing against her sweat-soaked hair. A medic tried to hand her a blanket, but she shook her head. She wasn't cold. She was thinking about how quickly control can vanish, how thin the line is between order and chaos, and how sometimes the smallest act, refusing to surrender, refusing to wait, can change everything. When the commander stepped out and stood beside her, he didn't start with an apology. He didn't have to. The silence between them said enough. In 90 seconds, she had rewritten the definition of readiness, of resilience, of trust. The infiltrators had planned every move, had calculated every angle, but they hadn't planned for her. She hadn't needed permission, or equipment, or validation. She had needed only the moment, and when it came, she owned it completely. Back inside, her name was already spreading across the comm channels, whispered by soldiers who hadn't seen the fight but could feel its weight. She did it without gear, someone said. She stopped them barehanded. And in that retelling, something shifted, not just in how they saw her, but in how they understood what strength really looks like. It wasn't about the weapon you hold or the uniform you wear. It was about what you do when no one believes you can. She stood finally, brushing the dust from her knees, the rising sun catching on the shattered glass around her. Behind her, the compound hummed back to life, power systems rebooting, lights flickering on. Ahead of her, the field was quiet again. She didn't smile or celebrate. She simply walked forward, the weight of the night still heavy on her shoulders, knowing that somewhere deep in the chain of command, the story was already being rewritten, not just about the mission, but about her.